Hi everyone, it's been a while since we last did a straight up painting tutorial, so that's what we're going to do today. I've got these Astra Militarum, specifically the command squad from the Combat Patrol box. I'm painting these up for a family member who wanted to start into the hobby, and I thought I'd help them along the way. My primer today is going to be brown, as this is going to be the standard Cadian scheme and brown's a really good starting point. I'm using this Plasticoat stuff, but I really can't recommend it for anything you're trying to do quickly, as it takes quite some time to dry. Jumping straight into painting the armour, we're going to use Cadian green from Citadel. What I'm doing here is layering over top of the brown, making sure that I leave that brown in the deepest recesses. Luckily with this armour it's quite easily segmented, so it's very simple to do this. You don't need to do any crazy blends or anything at this stage. Cadian green's rather thin, so you might want to use 2 coats here. I only used 1 because the next layers are going to cover it up, and any imperfections actually add to the final effect. The next layer is Warboss green mixed with my Cadian green as my first layer highlight. What I'm doing here is using a sweeping motion which creates a natural texture, much like if you were going to use a technique like stippling, which we are going to cover later if you don't know what that is. With this layer we're aiming for higher up, so on top of the shoulder pads and any areas that are more exposed to light. Once again, it might look slightly translucent, but that's really not an issue here. It's just going to add to that textured effect that we're going for. The next layer is pure Warboss green, just to enhance that effect. I'm going over a slightly smaller area than I did with the previous layer, and it makes it look like natural highlights. That's where we'll leave the armour for now, moving on to the fatigues. We're going to start with Steel Legion drab over the brown base coat, making sure that we leave some of that brown primer in the deepest recesses. The best example is honestly this company commander here, where we're using a sweeping motion to create a nice rough fabric texture. Next up we're using Xandri dust, but over a smaller area, making sure we can still see a good chunk of that Steel Legion drab, and definitely making sure we don't touch the recesses with this paint. The way you use your brush here is very important. If you're doing normal base coating, you want to do nice smooth passes over the top of anything to make sure you get a nice smooth layer. If you're trying to add texture, you want to use this sweeping motion. The technique you use entirely depends on what you're painting, the texture you're trying to bring out. Fabric always takes well to sweeping because it looks like the individual threads on a smaller scale. On some of the smaller areas, I'm also using a type of dry brushing. This wasn't necessarily planned, it was just as the brush started drying out before I added more paints, it looked quite good, and it was a very simple way of adding more layers. Dry brushing is a good technique for adding texture to things like fabric. I don't usually use it, especially not on a scale this small, but it's worth a go if your model is mostly robes. Now using Screaming Skull, we're going to continue in the process we've already been doing, looking for a smaller area and doing those brighter highlights on top of the fabric. This isn't the final step, but you could leave it here and it would look absolutely fine. Once again, the key thing here is that sweeping motion. Without sweeping and adding texture, these layers just wouldn't look amazing without blending between them. As it is, we're giving quite a rough and ready effect, which for guardsmen I think works. We're going to stick with Screaming Skull now and start adding some chips and scratches to all the leather areas. These are already brown, but I want to do an overcoat of Wildwood, which is a brown contrast paint from Citadel. The reason I'm adding these nicks and scratches is because leather cracks with time and use, and I wanted to reflect that. This is essentially me preparing my surface for a tint. Tinting is a very interesting way of painting. It's where you essentially prepare the surface, like I'm doing here, and then add a glaze of another colour over top to change its properties. It's really just a fancy way of saying I'm applying a filter. In hindsight, Screaming Skull probably isn't actually the best paint here. It's bright, but not bright enough to really show through the Wildwood in the way I wanted. So I would recommend using a brighter paint here. AK's Silver Grey would be good, or even perhaps Pale Sand. And then you do your thinned down tint of Wildwood over top, like I'm doing now. You could of course also just use the brown primer as your base coat for the leather and highlight up from there. You don't have to do what I'm doing here at all. I just prefer the colour of Wildwood than I do the colour of the primer. As ever, there's no one right way to do things, and everything I'm showing here are just guidelines, as opposed to actual rules. Captain Barbosa 2003. Moving on to the next stage, we're going to use the now classic Black Legion. There's no paint job I do that doesn't involve this paint, and if you haven't added it to your hobby arsenal, do it. it will make your life so easy. There are so many little black details on models, whether it's weapon castings or if you're going to do leather in black. This is just the perfect base coat for it. So that's been my TED Talk on Black Legion. The paint, not the Marines. I hate those guys. It's worth mentioning I painted all their hands in the black too, as I wanted them to be wearing gloves. I just think it looks cool. Next up, using another staple of my paint collection, dark aluminium from Vallejo. This is actually the first time I've gone on to a new pot. It's lasted for about a year. I do, again, recommend picking this stuff up. It's a 1, sometimes 1.5, depending on what you're painting on, coat metal. Next up, we're doing a very similar effect to what we did on the clothes and armor. It's kind of a blend between the two to highlight up the gloves and boots. The gloves I'm not necessarily 100% happy with, and you'll see why in a bit, but the boots I think turned out excellent. They have the right amount of shine, as any properly polished boot will have. Honestly, they could be facing some kind of cosmic monstrosity from beyond the pale, but that's still not going to be scarier than their drill sergeant, and they will absolutely have polished their boots. You know, at some point. You've got to get the blood off. To highlight up the boots, I went through Mechanica Standard Grey, Dawnstone, and then a very tiny spot highlight of AK's Silver Grey. You can absolutely skip the final step of Silver Grey as it adds a weird reflective tint. Again, I like that because it made it look like polished leather as opposed to just untreated leather, and that was a personal choice. I then used some Vallejo Pale Grey Blue to do all the white parts. The command squad has a bunch of chevrons and different patterns all over their shoulder pads, so it's worthwhile filling those in. Bear in mind for the standard Cadian shock troop squad, only the sergeant has something like that. Using the same colour, I also base coated the faces. We'll come on to that in a bit because I think that was the wrong base coat colour. It was at this point I decided that the armour needed a bit more contrast, so I went back in with Skarsnik Green, this time using a stippling method, which is just jabbing the brush gently, don't actually stab the model, but jabbing the brush into an area to create lots of little dots. Again, on such a small scale, it's kind of hard to do, but it does make a really nice effect, especially if you're using thinned down paints. I also use this for a very messy edge highlight, again to highlight that it's slightly chipped and worn. There are absolutely other ways to add battle damage to your models, and I've got many videos on that if you want to check it out. But this was me trying out a different method to add a weird layered textured effect to the armour as opposed to just adding chipping. This stage I jumped around a little bit, adding a few details that were unique to each model, so the hair on the commander or her power sword hilt, stuff like that. I also used Guilliman flesh over the faces, and this is where the base coat was a bit wrong. It meant the Guilliman flesh was really dark in the recesses and then really bright on the highlights, which wasn't quite correct. I do recommend using Rakarth flesh as a base coat for Guilliman flesh if you're going for that pale Caucasian style skin tone. Say that 3 times fast. Ugh. At this point I used Xandri dust to cover off all the areas that I wanted to be a wood effect, so the stocks on a couple of the las guns and the handle, the shaft if you like, of the ensign, or the standard battle flag, whatever you want to call it. Using Screaming Skull I created a rudimentary wood grain effect. On something this small it's not really worth going too high in contrast, but you can go right up to a white, because the next stage once again is to tint it with wildwood. Point to note, I did make sure to thin down the wildwood nicely so it acted more like a wash rather than a full-on contrast paint base coat. This is adapted from a method I saw on Night Shift's channel where he used oil paints to create a wood effect. I'll see if I can link that below. I once again decided I wanted a bit more contrast, this time on the fatigues, so I went in with some pale sand and added a very rough edge highlight. Then to add a bit more colour to the shadows, I went in with Seraphim Sepia, which wasn't strong enough, so I switched to Skeleton Horde contrast paint and added a nice glaze into the shadows. This added a nice ruddy, orangey kind of effect, and I applied this to the lower areas on the model. I almost once again said this step is optional. I think I've covered in a previous video, it's all optional. You don't have to paint. Anyway, I think this is quite a nice effect, and adding little glazes over things is always worthwhile. I toyed with adding a glaze over the armour, in this case probably quite a saturated green, but I decided against it. I quite like the desaturated look that we've come up with here. It makes the guys look a little bit more washed out and almost realistic. Not realistic perhaps in the methods we've used to paint, but realistic in terms of the actual colour palette we're looking at. Once I'd finished painting all the smaller details on the models, I decided to go to this ensign carrying guy and paint the standard he's holding. I'm not going to cover off too much. It was a pain to paint, lots of little details, and The technique wasn't that different, but it took far longer than I'd anticipated. Off camera, I tidied up the faces and added the bases. That's been my rapid fire guide on how to paint Astra Militarum. If you'd like to see more, let me know. I've been Sam. See you next time.